Hey, how's it going everyone? In this week's video, I want to talk to you about shutter priority for your X-T30. So in the previous video of this series, we talked about aperture priority and some of the things that you want to think about. So this week, we're going to cover shutter priority. Now, shutter priority is one of the ones where people don't really use very often, but there's definitely some use to it. The examples that I'm going to use today is actually some of the event photography that I've been doing for air shows, but it's also very useful for any type of sporting event or any type of photography where you need to capture motion, but you want to capture a specific type of motion, whether it's going to be slightly blurry or you want it to be crystal sharp. So let's go ahead and look at a few examples before we go ahead and look at the X-T30. So right here, I have some photography that I took during the Dayton Air Show in 2019. And on this particular picture right here, I was in shutter priority and I took it at 1/640. And as you can see, I actually have some really good motion blur of the propeller, but the overall image is pretty sharp. It's not going to be tack sharp. There is going to be a little bit of motion blur, but overall the image is very sharp. Unfortunately, a photographer stepped into the line of sight of this one, kind of ruining this picture, but I can show you some really good motion blur. And on this next picture right here, this was taken at 1/800th of a second. As you can see, the propeller blade has much less motion in it because I've increased the shutter speed. So there's going to be less dynamic movement of that propeller, which can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the type of photography you want. One suggestion that I do want you to think about when you're taking this type of photography is that when you're taking images, it's much better if you take a sharp image in which there's much less motion blur, because in post-processing, you can always add a little bit of motion blur. In other words, if somebody liked this image, but they said, hey, I would like to have a little bit of motion blur on propeller, I can easily add that in using Adobe Photoshop or some sort of effects editor, but it's going to be much harder to make an image much more sharper. But that's something that you need to recognize ahead of time when you're capturing this type of photography. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next picture. So in this picture right here, we actually have a mixture of jet fighters and also a propeller airplane. And as you can see right here, this was taken at 1/2000th of a second. And if you look at the propeller, you can see that there is no motion blur on the propeller at all. It is completely stopped. This is probably a not very good image, to be honest with you, because you don't want to completely stop that propeller, because it is going to make it a little bit more difficult to you on post-processing if you do want to add a little bit of motion blur into that propeller. It is definitely still possible, but I would like to have a little bit of motion blur in the propeller from the original image. And then finally, this is an image of a jet aircraft, and of course you can have really high shutter speeds on a nice bright sunny day. This was taken with f8, and this was taken at 1/1700th of a second. As you can see, you can capture nice clean images when you have shutter speeds this high, which is something that you would want when you're taking pictures of really fast moving objects. You really do need that super fast shutter speeds in order to cap crisp images. So these are some samples on why you should use shutter priority, because it does make life easier on you when you're trying to capture specific types of motion. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and check out how you can use shutter priority on your X-T30. So here is the X-T30. Now the last video that we talked about aperture priority. So that was setting this to A for auto, but this time we're going to be talking about shutter priority. So what we want to do is we want to manually set our shutter speed. So this is actually going to come off the A. So for instance, if I was going to be taking pictures of fast moving aircraft, I would probably be around 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second. And then I can make some slight adjustments using the rear command dial right back here. So that's going to be very easy to set up. What I want to do next is I want to set my lens to auto aperture, and then I want the ISO to be also in auto. So those will be the next things that we talk about. Now for this particular lens, you'll notice that there is no aperture ring, so we're going to have to set it inside of the camera. Now, depending on the type of lens you have, and most of the high quality lenses from the Fuji film system is going to have the aperture ring, and you're going to be able to set it to auto. So for this particular one, it's a prime lens, and you'll notice that the A is actually on the aperture ring, and all you have to do is you just twist it over to the A position to set aperture to auto. Now, in variable aperture lenses like this 18-55, you'll actually have it on the switch. So this would be manual, and then this over here on the A side would be auto. So that's how you would take care of it with lenses that actually have the A imprinted onto the lens itself. Now, if you have a lens like the 18-45 up here, which there is no aperture ring, you're going to have to set it through the front command dial, which we've shown you before. So it's very easy to do. If you push in on the command dial, what you'll most likely see is that you can switch between your aperture or your ISO. Aperture is also called f-stop. In this particular case, I'm going to switch over to f-stop. So as I move the command dial to the left, what you'll see is the f-stop actually appears at the bottom of the screen. This means that I'm actually manually setting my aperture, which is not something that I want to do. So instead, I want to move it all the way to the right until it disappears. Once this disappears, what it's essentially saying is that it's in auto aperture for any type of lenses, which you can actually set auto aperture on the lens itself. If you push in on the command dial again, it goes over to ISO, and what you'll notice down here is I am in one of the auto ISO modes. This is something that I covered in the last video, but if you did not see this, what you can do is you can come in here, you can go into the camera settings, you can go into ISO, and there are 3 auto settings. I highly recommend that you actually go watch the shutter priority video if you don't know how to set your auto ISOs, because I do go in depth into some of that. But basically, you just want your ISO into one of the auto settings. So if I were to move the command dial, you'll notice that it actually goes into different ISO settings. Once it goes into manual ISO, it'll actually let you set the number, but once it goes into auto ISO, it'll say ISO 1, ISO 2, or ISO 3, so you can set 3 different types of auto ISO. Once you have this in auto ISO, you basically are in shutter priority, because the only thing you're going to be controlling is, again, your shutter speed, which you can do right from the camera body. So it's very easy to adjust. As you can see, I am at 1/1000th of a second, but if I change the rear command dial, I can actually make some fine adjustments. So I can go to 1/800th or 1/640th. These 2 numbers were my primary shutter speeds when I was actually taking pictures of propeller aircraft. And of course, if I actually bump this up to 1/2000th of a second, this is what I would be doing when I'm actually taking pictures of jets or something like that, so that I can actually have a very high shutter speed up here. And for the X-T30, the maximum manual shutter that you're going to have is 1/4000. Now, before ending this video, I do want to show you one last thing. So if you go into the menu setting, you go into the camera icon, and if you scroll up, what I want to look at is the shutter type. As you can see right now, what I have it set to is electronic shutter, which means that the mechanical shutter isn't actually used when I take pictures with my X-T30 right now. I would highly recommend when you first start off to use mechanical shutter plus electronic shutter, and it will give you a brief explanation of this, which is the mechanical shutter will still work all the way up to 1/4000th of a second. That is the limit of the mechanical shutter on the X-T30. Once you surpass 1/4000th of a second, you can actually go to electronic shutter, which means the mechanical shutter will no longer work. Personally, for any type of professional work or work that's really important to me, I definitely recommend using a mechanical shutter, but that's my personal preference. You're going to have to do your own research and make up your own mind on that. So that was a quick rundown of shutter priority. As you can see, there's plenty of things that you can learn, and you can kind of style it to the way that you like it. This is definitely going to be geared towards the type of photography that you want to do. So there is a lot of experimentation that you're going to have to do yourself. I would also highly recommend that you watch some videos about mechanical shutter versus electronic shutter. There is definitely some nuances to that, but if you want to be on the safe side, always just use mechanical shutter. Just realize on the X-T30, it does stop at 1/4000th of a second, but for the most part, a lot of photography doesn't really need to go above 1/4000th of a second. So I don't really think that's a really big limitation on the X-T30, but again, that's something you're going to have to experiment. But that's all I have for this video. If you have any questions or comments, definitely leave it below, and I will definitely read through it, and I will try to answer the questions as they come up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.